Okay. So basically, I'm going to watch this debate and I'm going to take notes and try to understand what is being said.
What in this life necessarily involves a God?
The claim that you just made that logic doesn't evolve is itself problematic. Or excuse me, you said that logic evolved. Excuse me. I'm saying that that is a problem because logic doesn't evolve. There's no evidence that it evolved, and in fact, it's the kind of thing that's immaterial and invariant that is not like flux matter. It
But
shares
you're
no.
trying to bring it on the ground of evidence. I'm talking to you about the transcendental argument you're making, and for it to be true, it needs to be necessary that God exists. Do you agree with this statement?
Yes, and I'm saying that
So
that
you're saying you
this
cannot
is
picture of a creature in this world that's capable of logical processing without God existing? I cannot
yes,
have
because it makes no sense to say logic is just merely an evolutionary product. Because by definition, what logic is, I think that most people agree that it's an invariant abstract process or series of laws or principles, and you don't get immaterial invariant principles from flux matter.
So you could not get a bunch of matter together that would process information mathematically, such as make additions or subtraction or divisions.
The
You
laws of
think you
logic
cannot
are
have
not
this
material,
without God being there?
right? Because the laws of logic are not material.
Well, they can be implemented in a material device.
But the laws themselves
A
are
device
not
can
material,
perform logical processing.
right? But the
Like
laws themselves are not material.
yeah, but that doesn't matter. If you want
It
to
does. That's
imagine
the
the
heart of the
laws as
question.
existing independently, the computer it processes logical information and it exists in the physical world.
Right.
There's nothing
I
that
agree.
penetrates the computer from outside. When
Right.
it does a calculation, it works on its own. And if the computer had not been created by a human and was to exist somewhere in the universe out of random, you would recognize that there is such a thing as an arrangement of matter that can perform logical processing.
No, I'm saying that that itself proves that laws are not material because if they were, they could evolve into the opposite of themselves, and they don't. So if you believe that laws are material and they're part of the evolutionary process, then you must also believe that the evolutionary process is something that can evolve into the opposite of itself. Which is
I don't
self-refuting
believe that laws are
in themselves, and they don't. So if you believe that laws are material and they're part of the evolutionary process, then you must also believe that the evolutionary process is something that can evolve into the opposite of itself, which is
I don't
self-refuting.
believe that laws are material. I believe that laws are principles that we can hold in our brain and that we can judge a computer by this law and say whether the computer respects a certain form of logic or another. But you're recognizing that a machine could perform the operations that would satisfy a logical evaluator that would look at it and say, yes, that is true, and that this machine could exist in the physical world independent of any God.
No, I'm saying that it makes no sense to arbitrarily do special pleading, which is a fallacy, to say that I'm not going to accept a meta level question about what a law of logic is. I'm just going to use laws of logic in the world, and I don't want to deal with the question of whether they have any kind of independent existence. And I'm saying that I can prove that they have an independent existence by the fact of the absurdity of saying that they are part of an evolutionary process.
So that's a smokescreen. You are
No, it's not.
refusing to engage with the question of whether a machine can exist independent of your God, when in fact your argument relies on the very necessity of your God for these logical processes to be made. Do
Can
you
a
agree?
machine exist independent of God? Is your question?
Yep. A machine that would process 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 4 plus 4 equals 8.
I mean, it's a nonsense question because you're asking me to deny my worldview to say, could there be a machine that does these processes?
But
And I'm
CJ, I'm just like you, and just like
of saying that they are part of an evolutionary process.
So that's a smokescreen. You are
No, it's not.
refusing to engage with the question of whether a machine can exist independent of your God, when in fact your argument relies on the very necessity of your God for these logical processes to be made. Do
Can
you
a
agree?
machine exist independent of God? Is your question?
Yep. A machine that would process 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 4 plus 4 equals 8.
I mean, it's a nonsense question because you're asking me to deny my worldview to say, could there be a machine that does these processes?
But
And
CJ, I'm just like you, and just like you don't care what I think earlier, you said,
they have any kind of independent existence. And I'm saying that I'm not going to accept a meta level question about what a law of logic is. I'm just going to use laws of logic in the world. And I don't want to deal with the question of whether they have any kind of independent existence. And I'm saying that I can prove that they have an independent existence by the fact of the absurdity of saying that they are part of an evolutionary process.
so that's a smokescreen. You are
No,
refusing to engage with it or not. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself once in this debate and think about this machine. Does it exist or not? Can it exist or not?
Right. My point earlier was not to question your intellectual honesty in a moral sense. I was trying to point out what I saw as a contradiction. So I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm simply saying that I don't think the question makes sense. If I believe that God exists, then it's impossible for me to conceive of a world where there's atheistic computers that just do math functions. Like there's the atheist Texas Instruments world where the I mean,
So you've just acknowledged that you cannot conceive of it, and you don't want to conceive of it because you know very well that if a computer was out there out of the random arrangement of matter and was to perform calculations that if a human was to look at would judge are logical, it would prove that something can exist that processes logic without God. And you know that your argument relies on this machine not existing.
This is probably the most bizarre non-empirical atheist argument I've ever heard. So because you have no evidence or proof of this kind of thing or this kind of world where
because your argument does not rely on evidence. Your argument of transcendentiality relies on the fact that it's impossible for machines to exist
You're wrong about that not being an evidence. It is an evidence. It's a logical argument, just like Gödel's arguments are logical arguments. It's a logical form.
That's not what I said. What I'm saying is your argument of transcendentiality requires that God is necessary for people to exist in the state that they are, and you claim that the state and you state that the state that they are, which justifies this necessity, is the fact that they can process logic. And you refuse right now to engage with the theoretical machine example because you know very well that the minute you answer yes to my question, your entire transcendental argument falls. Jay, can you picture a fictive machine that would process logic and give the right answers, even if it doesn't know anything about the laws of logic?
No, I mean, this is a laughable argument. I understand that you're trying to sort of turn the transcendental argument around, but I'm saying that it's a misunderstanding of what the transcendental argument is, because you seem to think that throughout the debate, because we can conceive of something, that in some way that means that it's possible or exists. And there are all kinds of things that we can conceive of that are not possible and don't exist. So I literally don't understand what the argument is trying to say. It's not I'm not trying to avoid something.
Okay. I'm trying to dismantle your assumption that because you observe people processing logic, then God exists. God necessarily exists. That's your argument.
That's not the argument. The argument is not because I observe people processing logic. The argument is that there are kinds of things about not just logic, but also mathematics and other transcendental categories that cannot be empirically verified.
One by one. I'm going to do them one by one, but we start with logic. You claim that logic is part of the set of things that justifies the existence of God as a necessity.
Right. Because
And now I'm asking you, can you picture a computer that has the right responses to logical processing, but that exists in a universe where there's no God?
no,
Why?
because it's incoherent and contradictory.
What's incoherent and contradictory in the fact that
Number
these
one, there's no
atoms are
evidence for
arranged?
this thing. There's no evidence
No,
for this
you're
universe.
back to the evidence. I didn't ask if this computer actually existed. I ask in
So you want me
principle
to
if it can
theoretically
exist.
believe in things for which you have no evidence?
Absolutely.
how is
Because we are not talking about the real world. We're talking about your transcendental argument, which is a denial of
Don't
that very
understand the transcendental argument.
possibility.
It applies to the real world.
The transcendental argument is a denial that it's even possible that there would be machines that would process logic, that logic could be performed by a machine or a computer. You admitted that earlier. You said, I admit that it is a necessary condition that God exists for any sort of logical operations to be made.
To be possible, not to be made,
possible.
to be possible.
Okay, so there can be machines
That's
that
what a
make-
precondition is.
So there can be machines that perform logical operations that are in line with the laws of logic.
Okay, the reason this doesn't work is because every reference that you have as an individual to machines or to logic or to anything like that that you're using in this example, they come from this world. And they're necessarily conditioned by their existence in this world.
I'm using the word machine to communicate it to you, but can you picture atoms existing without any humans knowing about the term atom?
Can I picture atoms existing without humans knowing of the existence of atoms?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so I'm asking you to make the same thing about the machine. Forget that I'm calling it a machine. Forget that we have a concept of it. Can you agree that there are arrangements of matter that can output stuff that is logically true while it isn't guided by God?
No.
So you're denying that a computer could exist in a physical universe
Right.
without being guided by God.
Well, without there being
a
a worldview in which it's possible to make computers and have logic and so forth. I mean, where's this computer coming from?
This computer could be arranged by a bunch of flesh processing.
I mean, isn't this interesting?
creatures.
This is what the atheist has to fall back on: is this most absurd, hypothetical, imagined worldview, and that's because really the whole position is absurd and imagined. I mean, I'm arguing a very specific thing about
Jay,
transcendentals in this
The
world.
machine I'm talking to you about are human beings. It's not an absurd world. The world I'm talking about
That's a
is the real
paradigm
world.
assumption that you think humans are merely biological machines.
Yep. Do you have
but
evidence
you-
that
but
I'm
you
made
believe
of
that you wrote
anything
your
else
book.
than an atom, than a set of molecules?
This is
Do you have
ridiculous. You
evidence?
believe you wrote your book. So your book was the work of JF and JF's mind, right? It wasn't the process of a determined machine, right?
It was the process of a determined machine. It was the
So-
process
so
of
you
the
didn't have
neurons
your
in my
ideas.
mind.
You
What?
didn't have, and you're not making your own arguments right now. They're just a chemical determined process.
Absolutely.
So you're not making arguments. Thank you. I've won the debate.
All right. Bye.
No,
Wait.
I'm saying that if you
You
believe
serious?
No, but I told you at the beginning, I'm just a monkey-like creature with a mouth and a brain, with a quantaloupe to eat it and other human beings to
That's
exchange with.
self-refuting.
I didn't
That's the
claim anything
transcendental
else.
argument.
And your problem is that you cannot debunk this version of
I just
my life.
debunked it.
You cannot prove that it's impossible.
I just debunked it by the fact that you come to the debate and you make arguments acting like they're from your mind and you freely do it, and you just said that you are a determined machine.
Well,
That's
this is a
self-contradictory.
Okay,
Have
this
you?
is a class. Andy,
Jay,
this is important.
That's
I'm
called
not
the
into
determined
low
knowledge.
IQ
Calm down.
interventions. Andy, so you shut the fuck up for 1 minute.
Okay, fine, fuck, man.
So
All right.
This is a classical argument of the form of Stéphane Molyneux, which is you engage in discussion, therefore you accept all the rules of discussion. I didn't. I don't. I'm just a human being. I emit noise. There are other beings. They interpret this noise based on their own rules. Andy, you can go ahead.
Why do you have to be a dick like that? I was gonna ask one question that was part of this.
I was kidding, Andy.
No, that pissed me off, dude.
I'm sorry, Andy. I was kidding.
Just because you're triggered, you can't fucking just go.
Hey,
I was not actually triggered. I love you, Andy.
Can I
was
reply?
kidding.
Okay, I want to ask one thing. I think I want to clarify. When JF, what he's saying is like, have you proved that he could not exist without God? Meaning him being a monkey eating a cantaloupe, right? Can he not just exist like that without there being a God? Have you proved that there is a God for JF to be sitting there eating a cantaloupe?
So the argument is that is self-refuting and contradictory as a position. And no, my argument has nothing to do with Stefan Molyneux. I don't follow Stefan Molyneux, so I don't even know what his kind of.
So you don't know that it does have to do with it.
With Molyneux?
Yeah, it's the same form of argument. Molyneux proves moral realism using that strategy. He says, well, as soon as you engage in discussion, you want to share some things that are meaningful, therefore meaning exists, therefore blah, 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 and he moves on to moral realism. The fact that I engage in this discussion does not commit me to any structure in your mind. I don't care. I'm not bound by your rules and your interpretation of what this discussion is.
You're bound by objective rules of logic and debate. If you're not bound by objective rules of logic, then there's no debate.
Why can't me just sitting here, I was born and I exist, why can't I just be doing this without God? Like, are you saying God
because on the one hand, you guys want libertarian freedom in your socio-political sphere, and on the other hand, you're saying that you're a determined machine. So JF, your book is not your book. It's just a random process of determined chemicals. It's not. Right. You don't deserve any credit for that. And I'm saying listen, on my view, you do deserve credit for that because you have the ability to reason. You have a soul. You have a self. You have a will. There is freedom.
So let's move to this subject because you mentioned it in the introduction, and it's true that we've skipped it totally. This idea that I had it noted here. You're saying that, can you repeat what you just said? It is that the fact that I exist and that I write books.
This is sometimes called the naturalist fallacy or the determinist fallacy. And it's the idea that on the one hand, a lot of times the naturalist wants to have a kind of biologicized mechanistic view of the world, but they also want to have the other extreme irrational contradiction of total libertarian freedom. And these two views are totally incommensurable. They don't mix. And that's what I'm saying is a contradiction. Okay. You want both of those things. So your book is...
The fact that I engage on the public space as a libertarian would prove that I believe in morals, in objective morals.
No. It presupposes that you believe in metaphysical concepts like freedom, or that you are a self that deserves credit for your work.
No, I don't believe in metaphysical concepts like freedom. When I argue on the public space, I use words freedom. I descend from monkeys who didn't want to have other monkeys control their testicles. And in human societies, we've evolved to develop language. We're able to understand concepts that other people are talking about. We're able to agree on a common concept. The concept of freedom is not a universal concept. It is simply the fact that we consider that our actions in the world can be interfered by others or not. There's no statement that...
I don't think that's coherent. That's my argument. I understand what you're saying.
Well, let me complete my argument because I want to show you how this is not incoherent.
Okay.
So there are other machines around me that could stop my arm movement as I make an arm movement. When I say I am for freedom, I'm not saying everyone should be for freedom. I'm not saying it's a desirable state for every possible creature and it's an objective truth. All I'm saying is I'm trying to convince the monkeys around me not to block my arm movements because I know that they have genetic interests that are different from mine. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, it's understandable that I've evolved to send that kind of signals. I'm just telling to the other, don't invade on my liberties because I want to reproduce. If I didn't do that, what probably happened is that there were people not discussing stuff in human societies, not able to interact through language or not able to tell others to shut up when it's time to shut up. These people were outbreeded. And so today what we have is people who care about what others will do and who care to protect themselves from the actions of others. There's no
Oh.
inconsistency in what I've just stated.
I'm sure, of course, there is.
I just want to say one thing. Thank you to Prax Girl for the huge donation, $100 and she wrote, "Oh, JF, totally wrecked."
I'm not wrecked because that $100 is coming in my pocket, lady. No, but yeah, what is inconsistent in the picture I've just
Right.
made?
So I think that that's a great example of what I've seen consistently through the debate is the I don't want there to be anything metaphysical. And this is why in the history of Western thought, in the history of Enlightenment thought, and then into the atheistic philosophers and so forth, Hume and Kant, the reason that they started going away from metaphysics is because they're problematic. It's difficult to talk about rights, to talk about the notion of freedom, and on the one hand say, I don't want anything metaphysically related to that, but I also want this to be something that I really possess. I don't want to have any metaphysical conception of what a self is or what my mind is and its work and its products, and that I should receive the money for the book that I write. But at the same time, I also hold on my worldview that I don't believe in any metaphysical principles or truths, no absolutes, no universals, and maybe freedom is not for everybody else. But I'm also just a biological machine. So in other words, just because you want to say I don't care about anybody else's universal relations to these principles, I just want these for myself. Again, it's just like earlier in the debate about epistemology. When you study logic and epistemology, it's not about what you want or don't want or accept or don't accept, because these are principles that are objective. And you said, I don't accept the logical rules and principles that you bring to the debate. I mean, how, if that's the case, then there is no debate. I mean, I'm not being mean to you. I'm saying that I don't see how we could engage in a debate if
No,
there's
and we
not.
can see this is exactly where Molyneux reaches. This is exactly the form of his argument, where he doesn't want to engage with a moral nihilist because he knows very well that the existence of a single moral nihilist in this world is sufficient to prove that there's no universal truth about morality.
Okay, but
you're doing
JF,
the same thing here.
if you say there's no universal truth about morality, that's a universal claim.
It's a universal claim, but it's not a universal moral claim. I'm not saying there is a way
Actually,
we should
it is.
act. No, it's a
No.
statement of fact
Anytime
about
you make
possibilities.
If you make a truth claim, and by the way, earlier you said there are no universal truth claims. Now you said there is. If you make
It is a universal truth claim within a local physical system, which is my brain.
that makes no sense.
Yeah, it's the truth. If you kill all human beings tomorrow, this truth does not exist anymore.
I don't think you know what a universal claim is or what these ideas are in epistemology. They're not even.
Well, you keep saying that throughout the debate. I don't think you know. I don't think you read. I don't think you did that. If you had any argument to convince me that there is one thing that's wrong in my vision of the world, you would state it. You wouldn't
I've
send me
stated
to your
about 20
books.
times that you keep making universal claims and saying they're not universal, but they're universal.
I
That's a
didn't
contradiction.
say a single universal claim in that discussion.
You just did right now. You just said there are no
No.
universal truths, and that's universally. You just said it was.
No. These are not universal in the way you mean it. They are universal in the sense that they cover everything that we could agree on that we're talking about in this discussion. But there can be another JF on another planet thinking differently, and there would be no objective way by which he's wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and he's right. The moral truth would need to be determined by a behavior being objectively better, objectively
Right.
true.
So
There's no such standard because people can have their axis of value among many spaces, which can lead to disagreement and legitimate disagreements.
when you say
Disagreements
there's
that cannot
no
be
such
solved.
standard, no such standard is a universal claim.
There's no such standard that you've been giving me in that conversation.
I just gave it to you. You just said there's no such standard. You're relying on a
Okay, I changed my sentence. There is no such standard that you can provide me that would be objectively true.
Well, on your view, you just said that that's objectively true.
This is not a moral truth. No, but yeah, what is inconsistent in the picture I've just
Right.
made?
So I think that that's a great example of what I've seen consistently through the debate is the I don't want there to be anything metaphysical. And this is why in the history of Western thought, in the history of Enlightenment thought, and then into the atheistic philosophers and so forth, Hume and Kant, the reason that they started going away from metaphysics is because they're problematic. It's difficult to talk about rights, to talk about the notion of freedom, and on the one hand say, I don't want anything metaphysically related to that, but I also want this to be something that I really possess. I don't want to have any metaphysical conception of what a self is or what my mind is and its work and its products, and that I should receive the money for the book that I write. I don't want there to be anything metaphysical. And this is why in the history of Western thought, in the history of Enlightenment thought, and then into the atheistic philosophers and so forth, Hume and Kant, the reason that they started going away from metaphysics is because they're problematic. It's difficult to talk about rights, to talk about the notion of freedom, and on the one hand say, I don't want anything metaphysically related to that, but I also want this to be something that I really possess. I don't want to have any metaphysical conception of what a self is or what my mind is and its work and its products, and that I should receive the money for the book that I write. But at the same time, I also hold on my worldview that I don't believe in any metaphysical principles or truths, no absolute. Kant, the reason that they started going away from metaphysics is because they're problematic. It's difficult to talk about rights, to talk about the notion of freedom, and on the one hand say, I don't want anything metaphysically related to that, but I also want this to be something that I really possess. I don't want to have any metaphysical conception of what a self is or what my mind is and its work and its products, and that I should receive the money for the book that I write. But at the same time, I also hold on my worldview that I don't believe in any metaphysical principles or truths, no absolutes, no universals, and maybe freedom is not for everybody else, but I'm also just a biological machine. So in other words, just because you want to say, I don't care, say, I don't want anything metaphysically related to that, but I also want this to be something that I really possess. I don't want to have any metaphysical conception of what a self is or what my mind is and its work and its products, and that I should receive the money for the book that I write. But at the same time, I also hold on my worldview that I don't believe in any metaphysical principles or truths, no absolutes, no universals, and maybe freedom is not for everybody else, but I'm also just a biological machine. So in other words, just because you want to say, I don't care about any, I don't believe in any metaphysical principles or truths, no absolutes, no universals, and maybe freedom is not for everybody else, but I'm also just a biological machine. So in other words, just because you want to say, I don't care about anybody else's universal relations to these principles, I just want these for myself. Again, it's just like earlier in the debate about epistemology. When you study logic and epistemology, it's not about what you want or don't want or accept or don't accept, because these are principles that are objective. And you said, just because you want to say, I don't care about anybody else's universal relations to these principles, I just want these for myself. Again, it's just like earlier in the debate about epistemology. When you study logic and epistemology, it's not about what you want or accept or don't accept, because these are principles that are objective. And you said, I don't accept the logical rules and principles that you bring to the debate. I mean, how, if that's the case, then there is no debate. I mean, I'm not being mean to you. I'm saying that I don't see how we could engage in a debate if
No,
there's
and we
not.
can see this is exactly where Molyneux reaches. This is exactly the form of his argument, where he doesn't want to engage with a moral nihilist, because he knows very well that the existence of a single moral nihilist in this world is sufficient to prove that there's no universal truth about morality.
Okay, but
you're doing
JF,
the same thing here.
if you say there's no universal truth about morality, that's a universal claim.
It's a universal claim, but
Yeah.
it's not a universal moral claim. I'm not saying there is a way
Actually,
we
it
should
is.
act. No, it's a
No.
statement of fact
Anytime
about
you make
possibilities.
If you make a truth claim, and by the way, earlier you said there are no universal truth claims. Now you said there is. If you make
It It is a universal truth claim within a local physical system, which is my brain.
That makes no sense. A
Yeah,
local
it's the
universe.
truth. If you kill all human beings tomorrow, this truth does not exist anymore.
I don't think you know what a universal claim is or what these ideas are in epistemology. They're not even.
Well, you keep saying that throughout the debate. I don't think you know. I don't think you read. I don't think you did that. If you had any argument to convince me that there is one thing that's wrong in my vision of the world, you would state it. You wouldn't send me to your books.
I've stated about 20 times that you keep making universal claims and saying they're not universal, but they're universal. That's a contradiction.
I didn't say a single universal claim in that discussion.
You just said right now. You just said there are no universal truths, and that's universally. You just said it was.
No. These are not universal in the way you mean it. They are universal in the sense that they cover everything that we could agree on that we're talking about in this discussion. But there can be another JF on another planet thinking differently, and there would be no objective way by which he's wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and he's right. The moral truth would need to be determined by a behavior being objectively better, objectively true.
So
there's no such standard because people can have their axis of value among many spaces, which can lead to disagreement and legitimate disagreements.
When you say there's no such standard, no such standard is a universal claim.
There's no such standard that you've been giving me in that conversation.
I just gave it to you. You just said there's no such standard. You're relying on a universal.
I changed my sentence. There is no such standard that you can provide me that would be objectively true.
Well, on your view, you just said that that's objectively true.
This is not a moral truth.
There's one thing that a video that you made about a Trump or the administration basically removing funding from Planned Parenthood.
Oh, yeah.
Is that still going through?
I believe so, more or less. But the thing is, it's just the federal level funding. As a pro-choice individual, some of your fans won't like this when I say this. I know more than half of my fans probably don't like it. I'm pro-choice. As far as federal funding, though, it's okay if that gets rescinded. The states and private groups will step in. I don't want people who...
Opinion. I actually agree with that, yeah.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that he would see the logic of at least there not being federal funding. I think that, ultimately this does come down to questions of morals and paradigms. So I would disagree with the states funding it as well. I mean, this is kind of the libertarian way to get around this, is make it a states issue. Ron Paul has this kind of position. So I understand the logic of it, but ultimately, I think it comes down to a question of whether it's right or wrong, and not just a question of funding. And for me, even aside from like theological or religious moral issues, is the issue of the origins of the Planned Parenthood type movement in the U.S. and where it comes from and why it's actually funded. And if you look into that, I think there's also a case to be made against it.
I think you'd find that a great proportion of my fans, your fans, and everyone watching here would actually support them more if they knew where Planned Parenthood came from. Just gonna put that out there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about like basic eugenics,
eugenics, exactly.
Right. But the problem is that kind of stuff doesn't stop with one people group. It actually ends up being turned on the other group. And I think so. That's the problem where we are now, is that the same tactics that were used on different communities have actually turned against whites now, and whites are suffering.
The only thing that I would say is fundamentally this: whether you believe that abortion is right or wrong, government is always wrong and should not be playing a role in medical decisions. And according to my opinion, government shouldn't. If a community wants to say, we don't like abortion, we're going to discourage it, we're going to tell this woman, hey, please don't have an abortion, that's fine. Go ahead and do the moral neighborhood.
So there's a difference between life and death, and not all.
I'm trying to wrap my little brain around this transcendental argument. I think I need to learn more about philosophy, metaphysics. So we go to Aristotle. This looks like a job for Aristotle. Shit.
Introduction to Metaphysics. The philosopher Immanuel Kant once referred to metaphysics as a bottomless abyss and a dark ocean without a shore, while the American philosopher William James called it nothing but an unusually obstinate way to think clearly. In this lecture, we are going to provide an introduction to metaphysics. To do so, we will look at the history of the discipline, examine its subject matter, and discuss the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's influential views on metaphysics. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy whose roots stretch back to the time of the ancient Greeks, approximately 2,500 years ago. Along with ethics, epistemology, and logic, metaphysics is considered one of the main branches of philosophy. While there is no agreed-upon definition of metaphysics, it is often described as the discipline which is concerned with the ultimate nature of reality. However, to those not familiar with metaphysics, such a definition will prove rather vague. So in order to better grasp its subject matter, it will be helpful to examine the history of the discipline. A few hundred years following his death around the 1st century BC, Aristotle's works were being published in the ancient city of Alexandria. One of the works published was given the title Metaphysics, which literally means after the physics. This title was not meant to reflect the content of the treatise, as Aristotle had referred to the subject matter of it as first philosophy or theology. Rather, it was given this title because it had followed or come after the publication of a treatise by Aristotle titled Physics. However, due to Aristotle's immense influence, the word metaphysics soon evolved from merely being the title of one of his books to becoming the name of an entire philosophical discipline. While Aristotle's work covered a wide array of topics, there are two underlying themes to it, which many have pointed to as constituting the essence of metaphysics. The first of these themes is the study of first causes, or in other words, that which does not change and from which emanates the things in this world we experience. The interest in first causes is why God has been a prominent topic of metaphysics throughout history. The second theme is the study of being or existence, in which Aristotle attempted to identify and delineate the fundamental categories of being. The study of being is simply the study of that which is or that which exists. While Aristotle's conception of metaphysics continues to be influential up to the present day, the discipline did see some important developments in the 17th and 18th centuries. During this time, a group of philosophers known as the Continental Rationalists began to distinguish between what they called general metaphysics and special metaphysics. General metaphysics, or what they also referred to as ontology, is the study of being or existence and is in line with Aristotle's conception of metaphysics. Special metaphysics, on the other hand, was divided into three disciplines: cosmology, rational psychology, and natural theology. However, while general metaphysics was concerned with being at a broad fundamental level, special metaphysics addressed more specific questions concerning existence. Topics addressed within special metaphysics included such things as immortality, freedom of the will, and the mind-body problem. The interest with these more specific issues continues to the present day. However, the problems of general metaphysics, or what is more commonly called ontology these days, remains the most prominent area of metaphysics. Present-day ontologists, it should be noted, are not generally concerned with what the concept of existence means. Rather, they try to provide accounts or inventories of the things that do exist. Or in other words, like Aristotle, they are concerned with identifying the fundamental categories of being. Thus, ontologists will try to determine whether such things as properties, numbers, events, relations, souls, material objects, or universals exist, and if they do, what the characteristics of such things are. The question of whether universals exist is one of the oldest questions of ontology and has been debated since the time of the ancient Greeks. Universals are things which can be instantiated or shared by different individual objects. Examples of universals include redness, squareness, and beauty. Obviously, there are many different things which can be red, square, or beautiful, but the question is whether the universals themselves have any sort of existence apart from the particular things they occupy. Along with these questions of ontology, metaphysicians today, like the continental rationalists, also examine more specific questions. Topics addressed by contemporary metaphysicians include the nature of time and space, the mind-body problem, causality, what it means to be a person, and the problem of free will, amongst others. The philosopher Peter van Wagen has put forth 3 questions which he believes encapsulates the subject matter of contemporary metaphysics. What are the most general features of the world, and what sorts of things does it contain? What is the world like? Why does the world exist, and more specifically, why is there a world having the features and the content described in the answer to question 1? What is our place in the world? How do we human beings fit into it? As should be now evident, metaphysics deals with some very abstract questions which many philosophers, metaphysicians amongst them, believe may not even be answerable. In fact, the 19th century philosopher, F.H. Bradley, wrote somewhat humorously, "Metaphysics is the finding of bad reasons for what we believe on instinct." Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most influential philosophers of all time, was also skeptical about the ability to answer metaphysical questions. As he wrote, "Most of the propositions and questions to be found in philosophical works are not false but nonsensical. Consequently, we cannot give any answer to questions of this kind, but can only establish that they are nonsensical. They belong to the same class as the question whether the good is more or less identical than the beautiful." What did Wittgenstein, who it should be noted is by no means the clearest of philosophers, mean when he said that most philosophical propositions and questions are not false, but rather nonsensical? K.T. Fan provides an explanation in his excellent work, Wittgenstein's Conception of Philosophy. His point is simply this: philosophical propositions are not false. They do not misstate facts which could be correctly stated, for they do not state or misstate any facts at all. They merely look like propositions but are in reality not propositions in the strict sense. The attempt to say something, in the sense of stating propositions, about what transcends the world, the inexpressible, results in nonsense. In other words, Wittgenstein did not believe that the questions posed by metaphysicians could be answered with the use of language. Instead, the problems of metaphysics, according to him, transcend the world, or as Wittgenstein put it, "The solution of the riddle of life in space and time lies outside space and time," or alternatively, "There are indeed things that are inexpressible. They show themselves. They are what is mystical." However, it should be noted that even though Wittgenstein did not believe that most of the problems of metaphysics could be answered, he was not completely against the discipline. In fact, he was heavily influenced by the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who put forth one of the most elaborate and extensive metaphysical systems in the history of philosophy. And to conclude this lecture, we will provide a quote by Wittgenstein, which reveals his appreciation of metaphysics. "Don't think I despise metaphysics or ridicule it. On the contrary, I regard the great metaphysical writings of the past as among the noblest productions of the human mind."
Amazing!
Gentleman thinker, philosophical concepts explained in brief in a posh English accent. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy, just like aesthetics, logic, or ethics. Metaphysicians concern themselves with questions like, what is an object? What does it mean to say that something might have been true? What is a cause? What is a property? What is the fundamental nature of time? And so on. But these are all examples of metaphysics. More difficult is to say what metaphysics is, essentially. The reason this is so difficult is because metaphysics has changed. Prior to the Middle Ages, metaphysicians studied first causes and eternal things, as opposed to physics, which studied ordinary causes and ordinary things. But since the medieval period, metaphysics has expanded into all of the questions we just mentioned and more. Exactly what makes a question a metaphysical one is itself a matter of philosophical debate. Some say that metaphysics is supposed to explain the most fundamental features of the world, world, others say that it should run parallel to science, and still others say that metaphysics is a category for philosophical questions that don't fit anywhere else. For the common student of philosophy, examples of questions are still the most convenient way to understand the business of metaphysics. Subscribe to PhilosophyTube for more from the Gentleman Thinker. Till then, cheerio, old chap!
The Ideas of Nietzsche, Nietzsche and Metaphysics. In this lecture we will introduce metaphysics and learn about the first metaphysical systems proposed by the ancient Greeks. We will then proceed to understand Nietzsche's critique of traditional metaphysics, and finally introduce his own interpretation of the universe. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. The word metaphysics literally means beyond physics. Its subject matter transcends the physical sciences. The goal of metaphysical thought is an understanding of the essence of the universe, or in other words, the ultimate constitution of nature. For such an understanding, metaphysics must go behind or beyond the physical stuff which the sciences are concerned with. For this reason, metaphysics has often been described as abstract theory with no basis in reality. The ancient Greeks were the first metaphysicians. Cultures prior to the Greeks provided explanations for the nature and origin of the universe. However, these were myths which involved angry gods and animal deities. The Greeks were the first culture we know of to progress from the confines of mythological thinking, and search for naturalistic explanations of the universe. Early Greek metaphysicians asked fundamental questions which still plague the minds of philosophers today. What is the foundation of reality? What is the cause of its motion and evolution? What is its true nature? In contemplating these questions, some Greeks concluded that the visible world they perceived did not provide the answers they were looking for. There had to be a foundation which all of this rested upon, and a source or origin which the visible world was born from. They proceeded to assume that behind or above the visible world was a metaphysical world. They claimed this reality could not be perceived, but thought that its existence could be inferred. Everything must have an origin, even the visible world, and the origin of the visible world must be a metaphysical world, or so they thought. This reasoning led to the formulation of the two-world theory. The two-world theory claims the universe to be composed of two different realities. There is the visible world and the metaphysical world. Nietzsche singled out two philosophers in particular he held responsible for the popularity of the two-world theory, a popularity that has continued to this day. Anaximander was a pre-Socratic philosopher born in Ionia. He proposed the visible world to have its source in a metaphysical world he called infinite, indefinite, and boundless. All things emanated from this metaphysical world, and upon perishing all things returned to this infinite source. Plato lived approximately 150 years after Anaximander. His influence on Western thought is undeniable. The 20th century renowned philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said that all Western philosophy was a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato adhered to the two-world theory and claimed the universe to be composed of two different realities. Along with the visible world we experience, he believed there to be a metaphysical reality of forms which existed beyond the heavens, a reality which he called the true reality. Nietzsche, for reasons we will explore, did not adhere to the two-world theory. As he wrote in Human, All Too Human, "For there is nothing at all we could state about the metaphysical world except its differentness, a differentness inaccessible and incomprehensible to us. It would be a thing with negative qualities." Even if a metaphysical world were to exist, which, especially in his later works, Nietzsche denies as an absurd thought, there is no way human beings could have any knowledge of it whatsoever. Our minds have evolved to deal with the things which actually exist in this world, and we could never gain knowledge of a metaphysical world which exists, in Plato's words, beyond the heavens. Nietzsche thought that the belief in a metaphysical world existing beyond the heavens was absurd. Yet it was, and still is, a belief that is widespread. How could so many people, even academics and intellectuals, believe in such a ridiculous idea? In contemplating this question, Nietzsche entered the realm of psychology. He began to realize that belief in a metaphysical world is not arrived at through rational arguments or careful observation, but instead is an irrational belief motivated primarily by fear. Nietzsche pleaded with his readers not to succumb to such irrationality, and to realize that the visible world, a reality which can actually be experienced, is the only reality. Remain faithful to the earth, he advises us, and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. In order to understand Nietzsche's psychological insights, we must understand his analysis of the two-world theory. In postulating the existence of a metaphysical world, metaphysicians were degrading the visible world, either knowingly or unknowingly. The metaphysical world was held to be the source of the visible world. Through some process, the metaphysical world was thought to create or give birth to the visible world. Therefore, the metaphysical world theoretically could exist even if the visible world did not exist. This implies that the metaphysical world is somehow higher or more valuable than the visible world, an implication which led early metaphysicians to morally judge the two different realities. A moral judgment being simply a judgment about whether something is good or evil, right or wrong. The metaphysical world they claimed is good. It was called divine, immortal, and indestructible by Anaximander, and proposed to be the home of goodness, truth, beauty, and perfection by Plato. The visible world, on the other hand, was thought to be a defective and evil world, nothing but a shadow of the divine metaphysical world. Nietzsche asked himself why a non-perceptible metaphysical world would be called divine and beautiful, while the reality we actually experience, the visible world, would be degraded as defective and evil. Nietzsche began to understand that all metaphysical worlds were thought to be permanent and stable realities. It was an eternal reality, one devoid of flux, a world of being, to use the terminology of metaphysics. The visible world, as we all know, is a world characterized by change. Things grow, transform, and die. It is a world of flux, or a world of becoming. Nietzsche concluded that it was because the metaphysical world was posited to be a stable and permanent reality that it was deemed good, and it was because the visible world is a world of flux that it was called evil and defective. Why would a permanent and stable reality be called good, and a reality of change be called evil? Because change entails suffering, the pains of growth, fear, loss, anxiety, and death. Anaximander expresses the idea that the visible world, the world of change, is the home of all the things humans spend their lives trying to avoid or deny. Who is there that could redeem you from the curse of coming to be, he asks. Nietzsche explained that the search for a metaphysical world
This is making me think about, that's part of the curse of being a human and having a mind and remembering the past and remembering the change. And I don't know if other people are like this, but I dislike change and I'm nostalgic. And it's funny how when you remember the past, you wish you could go back there, and things seem so. You usually remember it well, but during the time you were there, you didn't feel that way. So I think a lot about Christianity. It's about appreciating the time we have now, which a lot of us, I feel like, we take for granted. and we look to the future, or we look to the past and we concentrate on those things. But I don't know, it's kind of reminded me of that.
World, or a true world, is really a secret desire to escape suffering. Man seeks the truth, a world that is not self-contradictory, not deceptive, does not change, a true world, a world in which one does not suffer. Other philosophers have claimed that the search for something permanent and stable in the universe has been ubiquitous throughout human history. As the philosopher L.S. Stebbing wrote, "There seems to be a deep-rooted tendency in the human mind to seek something that persists through change. Consequently, the desire for explanation seems to be satisfied only by the discovery that what appears to be new and different was there all the time." However, Nietzsche was unique in pinpointing the psychological motives which directed this search for permanence. He called this search the metaphysical need, and concluded that metaphysics has traditionally served the purpose of allowing individuals to delude themselves into thinking that beyond this world exists a more perfect and divine realm, a realm where suffering, fear, and death are absent. Philosophers degrade this reality of change on the basis that it causes so much pain, and elevate a fictional reality to the position of divinity. As Nietzsche wrote, "To invent fables about a world other than this one has no meaning at all, unless an instinct of slander, detraction, and suspicion against life has gained the upper hand in us. In that case, we avenge ourselves against life with a phantasmagoria of another, a better life." A phantasmagoria, for those unfamiliar with the word, is a series of imaginary images. Throughout his life, Nietzsche expressed this idea over and over again. To imagine another, more valuable world, he said, is an expression of hatred for the world that makes one suffer. Metaphysicians did not assert the existence of a metaphysical world because they spent years in disinterested contemplation.
But that's the thing, though. I think humans are this combination. There's these two things, like the flux and the stability. There's so the material world is in flux, and the metaphysical world, the immaterial world, is stable. It's unchanging, permanent. And humans are a combination of the two, because our minds are we're made in the image of God. The mind is the we have the mind and the body. Like, the mind is the connection to the metaphysical, like the fact that we love, for example. We can experience the metaphysical, but we're still also at the same time physical and in flux. And so humans are these like tormented beings. We're like self-contradictions. We're absurd. We I think we have to sort of, I guess, unite these two opposing aspects of what humans are. We're part infinite and part finite, and that's what a human is. And it's like they're at war with each other, and we need to unite and be holy.
Nor did they have some divine inspiration which allowed them to glimpse such a world. Instead, the metaphysical world is a world fabricated solely from psychological needs. Nietzsche thought that individuals who needed to believe in a metaphysical world were weak and cowardly.
Oh, it's like Einstein. It's see, common theme. So they use these people like Nietzsche, Spinoza, and Einstein. They've had these philosophers of Satan attacking concepts of God in the metaphysical world. And that's where we get these hardcore atheists, empiricists, materialists.
No matter how terrifying and tragic life may be, he thought that one must face it directly and muster the strength to endure and even affirm it.
I agree with that.
Contrary to this ideal of Nietzsche's, the vast majority of individuals have deluded themselves with stories of the existence of another world. A world where they believe their highest hopes will be realized, and their...
See, now this I agree with. I don't believe there's this immortal soul or personality stays intact when we die, and we have these, like, I don't know, spirit bodies and spirit heaven, and we still have our fleshly desires, because I'm sure people imagine heaven would be, oh, I'm gonna eat all the chocolate cake I want, you know, I don't know, have my wife there and my family. You know, they're thinking of desires of the flesh still. They're still of the world. So I just think that's really nonsensical. The Bible doesn't teach that. It teaches something about a new earth and where bodies will be new bodies. And so I don't know. I don't really understand what happens after we die. And the people that say they do, you know, I think they're full of crap because no one knows. So, I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, it's important to be a good person and to love each other because it'll make your life better. It doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to love each other and be a good person because you want some reward, you know?
Their failures on this earth will be redeemed. In a shocking passage, Nietzsche identifies Plato as a weak individual who was unable to endure life as it is, and thus an individual who deluded himself with stories of another world. As he wrote, Plato is a coward before reality. Consequently, he flees into the ideal. Nietzsche understood that most human beings were weak and cowardly, and so realized that most would require the solaces of metaphysical worlds and realities. Only the strong few would be able to remain faithful to the earth. He therefore understood the necessity of the faith in a metaphysical world. The decadents need the lie, he said. It is one of the conditions of their preservation. Without the comforts which accompany the illusions of metaphysical worlds, the decadent would collapse in utter anguish over life. Only the rare individual who was strong and courageous enough could live without the belief in a metaphysical world. Heraclitus was one such individual. He was an ancient Greek philosopher who did not assert the existence of a metaphysical world. I see nothing other than becoming, he said, or in other words, the visible world is all that exists. Nietzsche echoes this notion, giving credit to Heraclitus. Heraclitus will remain eternally right with his assertion that being is an empty fiction. The apparent world is the only one. The true world is merely added by a lie. Or to use the terminology we have been throughout this lecture, the visible world is the only one. The metaphysical world is merely added by a lie. So how did Nietzsche view the universe? What was the nature of his metaphysical interpretation? It was certainly an interpretation devoid of any sort of alternate reality. Nietzsche thought there was only one reality, and it was the visible world we could experience. Furthermore, he did not think it made any sense to morally judge this universe. In one of his earlier works, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche likened the universe to a child who builds castles in the sand only to destroy them. Creation and destruction in the universe are done so with the same innocence and indifference as a child building castles in the sand. There is no point in ascribing moral judgments to this reality, for it is literally a reality which is beyond good and evil. The universe to Nietzsche was the will to power. And do you know what?
It's weird. I kind of this is some of this is actually Christian. Like reality is beyond good and evil. Well, I don't know if that's, but the thing is, as Christians, we're not supposed to judge good and evil. It's like it's only God's will. And I think there's truth to that. Like I don't think we're supposed to build moral systems, because I think what Christ commanded us to do is love each other, and it's like a love that you can't put into a category or a commandment. It's like a metaphysical concept that we can't define with words, and it's just what we have to do, and that's God's love. And if we love each other, that's the message. Then we'll have heaven on earth. We'll have God's kingdom here now. We don't have to die and wait and go to it. That's what Christianity's about. And you don't have to make the whole world Christian to experience it. Just having love in your heart, you experience it. And that's the best. I mean, whatever. Like, even if I'm full of shit and what I say is not true, it's the better way to live. The only alternative is to have anger and hatred. So, I mean, I've lived that lifestyle, and it's not productive. It's a horrible way to be. See, and I also agree, I don't necessarily believe in this. The metaphysical and the physical world have to be these two separate worlds. The thing is, what Alan Watts, this is a thing I wrote a while back. One of the difficult ideas to get across and express well in any language which wants to assert a pluralistic universe in which there is no unifying ground. Any language based on this assumption is going to have difficulty talking about relationships, and that's what like metaphysics is about, a lot about relationships. So like you're asserting this pluralistic universe, so you're asserting that there's multiple options, that there's multiple universes. There's the metaphysical universe, and then there's the physical universe. But what Alan Watts is saying is our language in itself is pluralistic, and there's no unifying ground, so we can't express, like he argues in this whole thing, gets to paraphrase it, that basically cause and effect aren't necessarily two separate events. He says the effect can alter the cause as much as the cause can alter the effect. And he says, if I say the bark of a tree or the bark of the dog, the later event changes the definition of the first event. And he also gives an example of, like, if you see a cat through a window, you might just see like the head first, and then you'd see like the tail. So like someone who asserts the pluralistic universe or whatever, this cause and effect idea, could say like the head of the cat causes the tail, but they're missing, based on their bias, which is in their language, that the cat and the tail are one, right? So there's no like unifying ground of relationships in our language, and we see everything in like black and white. So basically I'm saying there doesn't necessarily need to be a distinction between the physical and the non-physical, the flesh and the spirit. They can be one and the same. Like, and this idea they get is crazy, that it came in Christianity too, in the metaphysics, where they thought the metaphysical world was good and the physical world was bad because it changes, like he was saying in the video. So I think that's a messed up way to look at things. I think it's all good. I think it's just there's a unifying ground between the two worlds. It's not necessarily they're separate, and that they're not. It's not. Neither one is better than the other. Like, we can't judge like that. So that's like craziness. That's just as crazy. It's the crazy thinking that what people are imagining 99 virgins in heaven or something.
Verse to Nietzsche was the will to power. And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. A firm iron magnitude of force that does not grow bigger or smaller, that does not expend itself but only transforms itself. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, as a becoming that knows no satiety, no disgust, no weariness. This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides.
What a sad man. He just seen power. No love. He ain't got no love. No love.
Joe cracked the dawn, Herb got it. Shante, Terror Squad. Be about us, be about you. Number one. Got to do with it.
It's about us, it's about just me. What's love?
Got to do with it, baby.
What's love? It should be about us, it should be about just me. What's love?
Yeah, slow down, baby. Let you know from the gate, I don't go down, lady. I want a chick with thick hips and licks her lips. She could be the office type, but like the strip. Girl, you get me aroused, how you look in my eye. But you talk too much, man, you're ruining my high. I don't wanna lose the feeling, cause the roof is ceiling is on fire. And you looking good for the getting, I'm a rider. Whether in a hoodie or a linen, a provider. You should see the jury on my women, and I'm living it up. The squad stay filling the truck with chicks that's willing to trizz with us. You say you got a man and you're in love, but what's love gotta do with a little menage? After the party, me and you could just slide for a few, and she could come too. That's love. Got to do with it, man.
What's love? It's about us, it's about just me. What's love?
Got to do with it, baby.
What's love? It should be about us, it should be about just
Yo,
me.
mommy, I know you got issues. You got a man, but you need to understand that you got something with you. This is fat, frame is little. Tattoo in your chest with his name in the middle. I'm not a hater, I'll just crush a lot. In the way you shake your booty, I don't want you to stop. You need to come a little closer. And let me put you under my arms like a dawn is supposed to. Please believe you leave with me. We be freaking all night like we was on E. You need to trust the God and jump in the car for a little heartache at the Taj Mahal. What's love? Got to do with it, baby.
What's love? It's about us, it's about just me. What's love?
Got to do with it, baby.
What's love? It should be about us, it should be about just me.
Yo, I stroll in the club with my hat down, Michael Jack style, high stepping, who the Mac now? Not my fault that they love the kid. Might be the chain or the whip, I don't know what it is. We just partying, bull. Come on, mommy, put your body in motion. You got it open. You came here with the heart to cheat, so you need to sing the song with me. All my ladies, come on.
Look in your eyes, there's no stopping me. I want the thought you attack, come rock with me. Don't want your stacks,
do with it.